And so Casey takes the last long walk to the clubhouse. It's goodbye to the Polo Grounds, farewell to the old, and welcome to the new. Shea Stadium, the new home of the Mets, to be ready for the opening day of the 1964 season. Here is a stadium that has been designed to be the greatest ever built for baseball, with a perfect view of the playing field from every seat. Not a column, pillar, or post in the entire park to obstruct the view. 55,000 seats, and nearly all of them within the foul lines. Everything about this stadium has been designed for the comfort and convenience of the fans. A series of ingeniously arranged ramps to avoid jamming of crowds before or after game time. 21 banks of escalators make the long, hard climb to the upper grandstands a thing of the past. There's a subway line that runs right to the ballpark, with a pedestrian overpass that leads from the Willits Point IRT station right to the stadium entrance. Bus lines, too, will go directly to the stadium, and nearby is a station of the Long Island Railroad. Next door to the stadium, the New York World's Fair in Flushing Meadows. You name it, this stadium will have it.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there, friends. How's it going? My name's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, as you know by now. The curious little podcast that's devoted to this crazy little genre that we've created for ourselves around the world of forgotten sports, that what used to be in professional sports, for that matter. Thanks for coming by. And let's see, whose voice was that? That was a young, dapper, and loud-jacketed Lindsey Nelson from the end of season 1963 recap of the New York Metropolitan Baseball Club, otherwise known as the New York Mets. Their final year of play in the fast dilapidating Polo Grounds back in the day. And what were they getting ready for? Well, you heard it. Lindsey sort of gave you sort of the gleaming future that awaited the New York Mets. And as we'll hear in our conversation with this week's guest, Matthew Silverman, the New York Jets, who were similarly ensconced in the Polo Grounds as the New York Titans. And they, too, undergoing a metamorphosis, I guess, with a new stadium known as Shea Stadium. It wasn't called Shea Stadium at that very moment. I think it was called Flushing Meadows Stadium. There was also a municipal label in there somewhere as well. But as we'll talk about with our guest this week, Matthew Silverman, the author of Shea Stadium Remembered, the Mets, Jets, and Beatlemania, and that's just three of the many amazing pillars of history and remembrances of the, I think, as over time occurred, the more lamentable Shea Stadium. But at the time, it was literally the future. We get into all the sort of backstory as to how this stadium was created in Flushing, Queens. The roles of various people like Walter O'Malley and hemming and hawing about a new stadium being built there for his Dodgers instead of in Brooklyn, and perhaps precipitating the move to Los Angeles for the Dodgers in the first place. William Shea, a very important character, and obviously the namesake of the stadium over time. A lawyer, part of the backdrop of the Continental League, a conversation we had with the late Russ Buhite on a previous episode. You remember that when the Dodgers and the then New York Giants left for the West Coast, New York was bereft almost overnight in 1958 of two of their three former baseball clubs. And almost from that day on, Mayor Wagner at the time, Robert Wagner, and a whole host of folks were eager to see if there was an ability to at least replace one of those lost franchises with something else. And the Continental League was certainly part of that mix, and a New York franchise, Houston, I think, as well, was sort of part of that. Minneapolis was out in the mix. I think Denver was in that mix. And whether it was sort of a grand ruse or it was an endeavor that was foreseen and blocked ultimately by the National League in their granting of two franchises in Houston and the then to come New York Mets. Intrigue for sure in that. There's also a guy named Robert Moses in the midst of all this stuff. The reason why it was Queens is actually goes back to, and this is not an interview with Robert Caro and the powers that be, but that book, for you who don't understand sort of the modern day architectural and geographic and civic history of New York, and why various highways and the automobile devotion, if you will, in terms of urban planning exists today, and why you are stuck on the Long Island Expressway all the time when you're going back and forth to Manhattan. Well, Robert Moses is part of that story and then some, and an outsized figure, arguably behind the scenes. He was never really elected, but he was probably the most powerful person at that time in New York City, in the area, in terms of his decision making when it came to bridges and roads and construction, and of course, in this case, this municipal stadium and the politics that came with all that. That's just the backstory, friends. We get into with Matthew Silverman in just a few moments. Some of the more unique memories around this stadium. Some of the events, of course, not only the Mets but the New York Jets as they became a powerhouse pretty quickly, and by the end of the decade, winning an NFL championship after the AFL, or as part of the AFL merger, at that point, the old Joe Namath team and whatnot. And of course, you can't forget some of the other iconic events, including music and the Pope visited along the way. But of course, the Beatles, right? In 1964, what a year for not only the brand new franchises joining this new facility, but also, the arrival of the Beatles. Now, the Beatles obviously were doing, of course, the Beatles were in 1965. The stadium opened in 64. But on August 15th, 1965, iconically, the Beatles opened their North American tour there. And by all accounts, it was sort of not the best acoustic experience. It wasn't sort of, this is sort of the early days, I guess, of sort of the big venues, the big outdoor arena kind of presentations for rock concerts. But, and arguably it wasn't even their best show of their tour. But the mania around it, of course, and the excitement and the conquering of the United States and being in New York and all that represents for, the United States as sort of the biggest city and its influence and all that stuff. It's still iconically remembered by even, Beatles fans of current generations who never knew or understood what Shea Stadium really was. They didn't know Mets from anything. They didn't know what the American football was about, but they do know Shea Stadium because the Beatles played their first concert there. And that's all part of the history too. And it's fascinating. And we love to focus on structures no longer with us. This is really not a show devoted to the Jets or the Mets or even the 1975 season, although we did have a conversation about that previous episode, which I highly recommend. 1975, what a crazy year in the history of Shea Stadium, because Yankee Stadium was being refurbished and was out of pocket. Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, was not online yet. I don't think it was available until early 1977. So you had four teams: the Mets, the crosstown Yankees, the homestanding Jets on football, and the Yankees domiciled until that point, New York Giants. All four of them playing their games in 1975, and where in the hell out of Shea? And as we'll talk about with Matthew in a few moments, in some respects, it almost was kind of the beginning of sort of the apex, perhaps, and the beginning of the end of Shea in terms of its modernity, shall we say, because, and we talked about this with Brett Topol in our episode number 87 about this 1975 year. It became a workhorse and certainly fine in that regard, but really hard. I think the upkeep and other stadia approaches were starting to come online that were certainly more modern and more advanced and that kind of stuff. And Shea, started, like a lot of stadiums in their teens and 20s, start to fade from glory without either renovation, refurbishment, rethinking, or frankly, as occurred finally in the aughts, demolition and replacement. And now Citi Field, literally just in the shadow of the old Shea. But we're going to talk about Shea Stadium with our guest again this week, Matthew Silverman. Again, the book is excellent. It's really good. If you're a New York sports fan or not, it's digestible, but it's really packed, deceivingly, with lots of great facts and tidbits. And I learned a lot about Shea, and I grew up in the area. Again, it's called Shea Stadium Remembered: The Mets, the Jets, and Beatlemania. All right, we get to that conversation in a moment's time, but a little promotional note from our friends at oldschoolshirts.com this week. How you doing, PF Wilson and friends in Cincinnati, Ohio, great city of these here United States. We've got some great stuff for you there at oldschoolshirts.com. As you know, lots of awesome shirts around teams and leagues no longer with us. So, there's virtually every logo out there available. You can search on the site at oldschoolshirts.com by city, by sport, by league even. But it's also not just sports. It's also things like cultural histories. Like I see a shirt for Columbia House Records, if you remember sending a penny to them to get your 12 LPs and then figuring out how to get out of the the contract that you essentially are in to buy records at the bust out retail price. Various record stores like J&R Music World in the New York area, or radio stations of the past, or malls, or all that kind of stuff. It's just a trove of stuff, and they keep adding stuff more all the time. It's oldschoolshirts.com. But this week, there's a great Shea Stadium shirt there. It's in this sort of baby blue with sort of a contrasted white and orange to replicate the look of the inside of the bowl of Shea. It's great. You'll find that there at oldschoolshirts.com. You'll also find some things that are in and around that time period. The first ever Jets logo from 1963-64, as they were getting ready to transform themselves from the Titans, that sort of literally looks like an actual jet, a white jet with the green letters saying JETS. That logo you don't see very much anymore, and it's almost very rare. And there's also an excellent New York World's Fair shirt there too, for commemorating the 1964-65 World's Fair, which was also part of this story, by the way, because right next door to Shea Stadium was this World's Fair. So in 1964, when this place opened up, in 1965, when not only the teams were playing, but the Beatles were playing, you had this World's Fair going on, and it was the place to be at that time, and the future looked very bright. Let's commemorate all that stuff, why don't you, by wearing some shirts from our friends at oldschoolshirts.com and use that promo code that we love to give to you and help you save. Promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code. I think it's one word, but maybe you could do it two. Try them both ways. But you will get 10% off all of your purchases at oldschoolshirts.com. High quality stuff, high quality people, and high quality customers, and we appreciate you checking them out. And you'll be glad you did, as they say. All right, let's get into the conversation. Let's waste no more time. Here is our great conversation. Let's remember Shea, the great Shea Stadium, with Matthew Silverman. Here's our chat we had just a few days ago. Please, as always, enjoy. I think to say that you're a New York Mets fan is kind of sort of an understatement and kind of assumed, because you have penned a number of different books about Mets fandom. But is journalism your first calling? Is this your sort of your day job, or is this sort of...
Well, journalism was my first calling, and then I found out that I didn't really like it that much, and actually it's after reading that book, a book about the Mets, The Worst Team Money Could Buy, and they went into a lot of description about what the life was like of a beat reporter, and that had been my goal, up until then. And I was like, this sounds like it really stinks. And I kind of changed my trajectory. Plus, you're on the road all the time, and in the best of circumstances, you're working when everyone else is having fun. So I kind of tried to, work towards being an editor where you at least had some more control of where you were. But then I ended up working with the people that did the baseball encyclopedia and Total Baseball, and that was got me into book publishing.
Got it. So a little bit more stability versus sort of being the sort of a beat reporter and trying to sort of, game 87 of a long season, trying to get a new angle, a new story, and some
if you made it, it's like because guys that are in the minor leagues. I was deep in the minor leagues, and you never know if you're going to actually make it. There's only a certain number of those jobs out there.
Well, look, we look for any excuse on this little show to sort of get into things, whether they be teams or leagues or even stadia or various other ephemera that is no longer with us in pro sports. We love the defunct. We love the forgotten. We love the relocated, the expanded, and previously domiciled, all that kind of stuff. And certainly we've enlarged our aperture to include things like stadiums. And we've had an interesting conversation, as you probably well know, with our pal Brett Topol on the 1975 unique season of Shea Stadium. But this is, I think, the most comprehensive book that I've found out there. And kudos, because it's so extremely well researched and stuff. This is just a treasure trove, this new book, on all facets of Shea. And while it's sort of labeled as being essentially sort of tied in as a history of the Mets, I think you've done an excellent job, because you've actually expanded it to all the things that Shea Stadium, obviously the Mets being probably the biggest heartbeat of that stadium, but maybe a little bit of a background as to sort of why you felt that this beloved and sometimes much maligned stadium needed a book treatment.
Well, it would start with this company had worked with a few times, Globe Pequot. They sort of asked me to do it, and because I don't know if I have the chutzpah to say, how about a book on Shea Stadium that everyone so many people lament and give a hard time about, but they had done a book on Candlestick, and I read that, and I'm like, if there's this book on Candlestick, there's definitely room for one on Shea Stadium, because Shea Stadium is like Dodger Stadium compared to Candlestick, and I was really I guess touched that they asked me to do it, because there's a lot of people out there who could have handled the topic, and it made me work that much harder to make sure that I got stuff in. And there's still there's no complete list, because I looked for them repeatedly that has like every event that ever took place at Shea Stadium. They just they made the stuff up as they went along for a lot of it. And I'll be like, oh my gosh, there was that event in 1972, and that I just wasn't on any kind of main list, and I never came across it in there. But I tried to get as many different representations of it. To be honest, when I was listening to the thing that Brett did, I didn't realize, I knew that Grambling had played there, but I didn't realize the reason that Grambling played there. I just figured they played there because everybody else played there in 1975. Was they used to play at Yankee Stadium every year, and they had that game there, and so I'm still learning stuff about it. I have like a little tally in the back of all the games that were played just by the big four the big four teams that we all know about. But, there were so many other little events in there, especially since it was a municipally owned stadium. And New York could essentially say, they're coming here, make yourself scarce on that night.
Well, I'm guessing, though, this somehow has some overlap with you being a fan of some sort of the Mets. Oh,
yeah. I say it somewhere in the book that my first game was actually a Yankees game at Shea Stadium in 1975. Old Timers Day, actually, and I went to my first proper Mets game a few weeks later, and it was a nondescript, Saturday afternoon game following a twilight doubleheader. So they had this, lineup with Jesus Alou and Gene Klein's, God rest his soul, recently passed away, and some other guys that you might not remember were Mets in there, but it was like the whole world opened up to me that day, and the Mets won.
So were you a Yankee fan essentially going in, or was it just this was the first?
No, I really kind of got into the whole thing late. I didn't get 1975 was sort of the year. I was forced to decide what team I liked, and before then I didn't like either team. I didn't really care much about baseball, and I went to Iona Grammar School in New Rochelle, and it was a very baseball-heavy school, all-boys school, and the teacher was going to let us, back then the game started at 2, and so it's the last 45 minutes or so of the day. He said, you can watch opening day, but you got to, we only have one TV, you can only pick one game. And there was no clicker, so you watched one, and that was it. And we had a tie vote, maybe 14-14 or something like that. And everyone's looking at me, and I'm not even paying attention to what they're talking about. And they're like, "Well, what is it?" And they, kind of put me on the spot, and I didn't really have any inkling one way or the other. And I went with Mets because most of the people that were saying I should pull that were my friends, and a lot of the other guys weren't, so I went with that. And I've been stuck ever since.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, fate has it played a cruel hand for you that day. All right, well, give me a sense then of how you approach a book like this, right? So it clearly seems that chronology matters, right? You're sort of hinting at trying to make sure that you get sort of all the events, perhaps. Is that where you start, or how do you start? Because obviously the story predates the structure by a bunch of years, maybe arguably even to when the Dodgers and the Giants left town in the late 50s for California.
Yes. It does sort of begin there, and actually I took it a step further, and I even looked up in one of the reports they had, the kind of stuff you can find on the internet, from that had the geology of the area, and that it had been a going back to the Ice Age, that there was all the silt that sort of deposited in that little spot, and that's what made all the salt marshes that the area became sort of famous for. So I went back to there, and then there was the Great Gatsby has that scene about. F. Scott Fitzgerald used to live just over in Queens, and sort of describing his commute. And so I've actually used that in a couple of other Mets books I've done as well, because, why wouldn't you? Mets aren't necessarily that literary, and you get F. Scott Fitzgerald in there, you might as well try. And so I had those two areas, and then, of course, the Dodgers and the Giants, and their leaving is the whole reason the Mets exist. If one of them had left and the other had stayed, there might not be a Mets team, but it was sort of a package deal, and so they, that's how the Mets came to be, and it wasn't easy to get a team either. The National League really didn't care if New York didn't have a franchise, but the people of New York did, and a lot of work, and ended up getting it.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, too. I think a lot of people sort of, especially newer to the Mets fandom and family, shall we say, kind of just sort of assume that the history kind of began with Shea. Obviously, the team itself was granted, and they played a few years in the fast falling apart third version of, or fourth version of the old Polo Grounds. But it's interesting as well, though, the whole idea about building this municipal stadium really was originally centered around this thing called the Continental League, which was, Branch Rickey and a third league that was, essentially pushing the buttons on trying to expand baseball a little bit faster perhaps than it was. And it obviously settled into finally the Mets being granted an expansion franchise in the National League. But I guess the real story of this stadium, the structure, really kind of sort of is bandied about with the guy it was named after, this William Shea character, who was part of all of that mixture, I believe, in the Continental League formation and discussion.
Yes, because he realized early on, a couple things. One of them was he didn't want to be the person that stole another team's, city's team like it had just happened to them, which I think a lot of cities could learn that lesson and try and go from another area, and so the National League wasn't interested, and they really wanted a National League team because they already had an American League team, but that was not going to do. And when they couldn't get the National League, they decided they would create their own league, and New York was the principal name in the Continental League, which I think they were like 5 hard and fast teams they were planning on doing, and I think they had a couple of others thrown in there, but the whole thing existed on paper. And what really, and once they hired Branch Rickey to be president of the league, he had been maneuvering and doing all kinds of stuff for years and made the major leagues nervous. I mean, he is the guy that integrated the league, that didn't want to be integrated in any way, but did because he sort of made it happen and made sure that he and Happy Chandler made sure that it did happen. That Jackie Robinson Day is right upon us, and it is important to note that it was a really good business decision too. It brought the game to a lot of different people, and just in a different but sort of the same vein, bringing a baseball team to New York, even if it wasn't a National League or American League team, because at the time it is funny to note that there was no other league. There wasn't an AHL. There was an AFL in the works when the Continental League started coming along, but there wasn't a WHA or ABA or anything like that quite yet. So it was a radical idea, but it was one that was obviously about to crack wide open in a bunch of other sports. So it could have very easily been a third league, which I can only imagine the maneuvering they would have had to get all those teams in the World Series. But the AFL was originally a joke when the the Titans, the Jets, Titans, came in. They were drawing 2,500, maybe 10,000 for a big game if there was such a thing, and playing in the Polo Grounds was completely dilapidated, and I think they had to, there was probably like pigeon poop still in the press box for the first game. And they also played 2 years before the Mets. Actually, two full, 60 and 61 they played before the Mets had ever gotten all their T's dotted and all the scrubs from every other team.
Well, it's my understanding that the stadium proper was essentially born out of the baseball situation, and the AFL sort of came a little bit after that fact for sort of maybe somewhat parallel reasons, but there was a contingency. My sense is that around 1960 or so there was this idea of, I guess it looks like the National League wanted to sort of just preempt whatever this Continental League was going to be. And part of that, I guess, that process, especially to come to New York, was somewhat of a guarantee that a stadium would be built. Is that right?
Yes, like Shea Stadium is a whole reason d'etre for the Mets, the Continental League, for all this stuff. Like, if that doesn't happen, there's no team of any type. I mean, maybe if the Continental League, maybe they could have found some other place to play, but there was no way they were getting, that they were going to get the approval of everybody for that. And also, another thing to preface is that the concept of having someone pay for your stadium, who wasn't the owner of the team, was not a common thing that it is now. I mean, even when the team is paying for it, there's a lot of other capitalization that goes along with it that has to do, that is done. But at the time, it was not necessarily done in New York. A sophisticated place. Not necessarily that was everybody's first thing. There was a lot of maneuvering behind the scenes in order, by everybody in order to get this to happen, and have people sign off on it. And New York is famous because there's, or renowned because, unlike a place like Boston or Philadelphia or something, where everybody is, or especially in Boston, everybody is a fan of that team. In New York, you've got, 30% of the people are Yankees fans, 20% of the people are Mets fans, and 50% of the people couldn't care less one way or the other. So you have all those people who are, wondering why you're not putting that money into schools or on all these parkways that everyone's building instead of this, stadium. And also the concept that you would have a football team that didn't play there or played somewhere else was ridiculous. I mean, that's what stadiums were for, and it took until, I would almost say 40 years ago, when Camden Yards came in was really, and that's like 30 years ago this year, was really when there was no looking back after that like new stadiums were all going to be for one sport or the other. But before that, it was common that both teams played baseball and football in the same stadium. It wasn't quite as common that the other team didn't get to play until the baseball team was done. But, almost every team that had both sports played in the same stadium, except for Kansas City was one notable exception.
Yeah. So before we sort of leave the Continental League sort of part of the story, I think it's also important to kind of throw in another character in all of this, and that's Robert Moses, right? So the power broker and Robert Caro. I mean, that's hundreds of pages of intrigue about sort of the most powerful man at that time, and arguably, even still legacy today. Never elected, but was probably most single-handedly responsible for the goods and the bads, if you will, of the topography of the New York metropolitan area. And this stadium is certainly part of it, right? We're talking about sort of leading up to also the World's Fair and the automobile as being sort of the preeminent or predominant, at least anticipated manner of getting from one borough to another, and all kinds of logic challenges there. But I guess the question really is with Robert Moses and William Shea. I guess I'm really curious, and maybe you have an answer to this, maybe you don't. But the William Shea thing, right? He's at once, Shea is the sort of like yang to the yin of Branch Rickey with the idea of founding this third league. Yet he's also the guy, Shea, that winds up working hand in hand really with Moses to get this stadium built and, if you will, bring the National League to town. So I guess the question in there is, and this is my ignorance, maybe, and again, maybe you don't have an answer. Is Shea doing this almost as a front, maybe this Continental League, in order to get the National League team and the stadium built in New York, or is that just too conspiratorial and naive on my part?
I've never heard that, but at a later time, I would say, even 10 years later, with all the maneuvering that went around with Yankee Stadium and Giant Stadium and all the stuff that led to, Shea being the place to be in 1975, there would be more to it. But I think part of it was that, he was a big sports fan. He played basketball at Georgetown. He had owned some piece of one of the, I think, AAFC, the second football league.
Sure.
It was a sportsman type, but was more of a civic leader. I mean, he really put his legal practice on hold, and he was one of the big firms in New York. And in order to do this, because it took all of his time, when you needed to look something up, you had your secretary and 3 other people go through the files to find it, as opposed to look on the World Wide Web or something like that. They put all everything they had to it, and he'd also been appointed more or less by Robert Wagner, the mayor at the time, who still had egg on his face from, you would say Robert Moses running the Dodgers out of town. And in the same capacity running the Giants out of town because the Giants went lock, stock, and barrel out to California with the Dodgers.
So this almost seems almost parallel to what I would argue smaller markets around the country that had not sort of benefited yet from what was going to be a large expansive and challenger league thing in possibly with baseball, but certainly in football and other sports and stuff, where a lot of these cities, Kansas City and Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Denver, they all sort of looked upon either baseball or football, or preferably both, or even basketball and hockey for that matter, as being validations of major league status, right? Hence, going after not only that kind of status and those kind of opportunities, but also the stadiums and the infrastructure needed to woo and cajole said to come. But in New York's case, right, this is almost getting two franchises for each, if you will, because hell, we're New York, and number two, we need to make up for lost time here because our market is outsized, and we should be satiated with more sports goodness, and we've got the resources to do it.
Yeah, and New York had they did have three baseball teams, but they only had one of the other sports. There was only one football team and one basketball team and one baseball team, one hockey team for a good period of time in that whole from World War II to the Mad Men era. There was really only one team until people started trying to find a way to get the National League back in town. And because even then, a lot of Yankees fans and Mets fans just don't see eye to eye. But it was even more so because, all three of them hated each other, hugely, where there might be, if there's so many Dodgers and Giants World Series that maybe one would root for the other in a devil's bargain kind of a thing, but because they hated the Yankees so much. And baseball was so big, people might be, now listen, like, so what? There was one baseball team. It's not even that big of a thing, but it was a big thing. It was the sport. Football had just sort of come into its own and still had a long ways to go. It really didn't, until Joe Namath arrived, and also not to get ahead of ourselves because he's a big part of the Shea story, sure. That it was sort of a one-team league, and baseball was the sport. And in the 60s, it started to change, and to what we have now, where football is definitely number one, and everything else is, at this point, is sort of jockeying for number two. Even with, I know our family's gotten very into hockey in recent years, just because it's such a great game to watch.
So it's probably fair to say that the Mets, of the franchises of the two, the Titans becoming the Jets and the newly crafted Mets, the Mets were really the kind of, shall we say, primary tenant in the beginning of things. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, and like the entire time the Jets were there, they were the second tenant.
Even though Shea and Moses were couching this as a municipal stadium of multiple benefits.
Yes, and until Joe Namath came there, the Jets were a complete afterthought, and you could even make that argument that they were still a little bit that way until they won the Super Bowl, and before that they won the battle with the NFL. That once Namath was there, it was hard for the NFL to say, well, this is just going to go away. They're not going to make it. They're going to be like, if you're old enough to remember it or heard about it, the USFL, that they kept saying, oh, it'll go away, and it did, but not for for reasons that are too numerous to go into here. But that it was the Jets, the Titans, which was what the team was called. They got a makeover. They were made by the AFL. Moving into Shea Stadium, and the AFL itself took on a new light. I mean, Shea Stadium, or Polo Grounds, was one of the least populated stadiums during the AFL's first couple of seasons, and then first couple of years at Shea was pretty good. It was better attendance, but then once Joe Namath got there, it was insane. And I think once Shea opened, Shea had better attendance than any team in the league. And then Joe Namath just made it, a sellout, more or less.
Yeah, and there's also sort of that new stadium smell. And
yes.
Right. So and look, I think it's also really important to understand. Obviously, my sense is that it was originally scheduled to kind of open up in 1963, but by happenstance, I guess, and delays, and maybe more fortuitously, it opened in 64, which was literally 5 days either after or before the opening of this semi-non-official but still world-renowned, quote-unquote, 1964 World's Fair, just literally steps away. So it kind of talk about a magical time, I guess, to be a New Yorker and having a brand new, fresh stadium, two basically relatively new teams in the top two outdoor sports, and the world basically knocking at your doorstep with just this fascinating and still talked about today World's Fair. Yes,
and one of the things that I hadn't really had to look into too much was how the World's Fair did, or Robert Moses's part in it. But since it was just really on the stadium, I thought it was worth looking into, and I didn't realize until I started researching this book that it was not a success. The first year, Moses, who rammed it through, they were, the World's Fair was essentially telling him, no, you just had one, there's another one going to be in Canada, and there's, this, and this, and he didn't, listen to any of it, and as a result, did not get a lot of the European support that you would normally get for that kind of a thing, and also keep in mind, this is when color TV was like a new thing, and people like new stuff. That was what people liked about Shea. It was new. If you tried to build Camden Yards in 1962 instead of 1992, they would have said, "What is this stuff? We want something new and modern. This is the space age. This is the Kennedy years. They wanted something that was brand new, that was different, that was sharp looking. That was neat with all a lot of those stadiums in that time were all the same dimensions, which also made it easier to, for changing it around for football, as it came up. The one thing that they didn't do, probably only because it hadn't been invented, was they didn't put AstroTurf in. And M. Donald Grant, for all that he did to, hold back the Mets over the years, was adamant that he would not allow, he would stand on his head to make sure there was no AstroTurf there. And apparently the Mets did have enough pull that they were able to keep that from happening. Plus it was spending new money, which at the time, probably wasn't popular either.
Well, so describe a little bit for our audience who maybe of a different generation or two, or just don't, didn't grow up in the New York area or whatever, sort of the unique standout features of this. I guess it was called Flushing Stadium for a while before it was renamed Shea, but I certainly part of it was the suspension or the architecture. Didn't have any posts and obstructions, and
that was a big deal.
It wasn't fully encapsulated like a donut like the successor multi-purpose stadiums were. But what were some of the sort of features that were kind of the selling point that made it truly modern, circa early '60s?
Well, and it was new. That was really important.
Plus that
it could be made into multiple sports. You could have they did briefly talk about a dome, but that kind of just went away. Plus, it was going to cost a lot more. And, at the time, no one really knew if a dome that size was, going to work anywhere but on paper. The Astros get credit for doing that, as well as the AstroTurf. But what the Shea Stadium had, it had, you could walk through, you could walk all the way around underneath the stadium. You could go from the bullpens all the way under the stadium. Batting cages were not quite the thing, but you could, make some ad hoc BP in there. There's a great story from Skip Lockwood's book that I borrow about how he became a Met in the middle of a doubleheader, and I think Jerry Koosman was getting shelled, and they drove him around and they took him to the Expos locker or the Expos bullpen and like pulled a fast one on him, and before he knew it, he was warming up and he was in the game. But it had things like that were state of the art, and it being asymmetrical was a selling point. It looked very clean. It had this that I don't know if you call it Art Deco. I'm trying to remember what the word is, but that funky panels on the outside of the stadium that were really distinct. And I remember, as a kid going to the games, and that's what was on there. And then after the team was sold in 1980, I lived in Westchester and White Plains, and so I didn't really drive by there very often. I didn't know until we went to the game that they had taken them all away, and and that was so distinctive. You could drive by there and see it glinting in the sun for miles on the way into the city, or on the way to Long Island to the airport or whatever. And they had a lot of touches like that were nice, but it wasn't overly frilly, because it also had one thing I should let in on, is that it had all those escalators. People didn't want to walk; they wanted to glide in the escalators all the way up to the top, and anyone who went to the upper deck from the lower deck could do that, or you could go up the ramp all the way to the top without really having to take any steps, which they weren't really thinking about people who were in wheelchairs or handicapped or anything like that at the time, but it was cool to do. You didn't have to worry about people falling on the stumbling out of there drunk or after some ecstatic Mets win or something like that. Although they did have a couple of people that did fall from the escalators, and they, if you ever went coming back from down the upper deck and you didn't walk down those things, that they often would have them open, those did not work going down. You had to physically walk down the escalators coming down, because they were steep.
It's also unique, I guess, at the time. I mean, a couple of things. Number one, it's also shifting the center of sports gravity, shall we say, further away from, say, Manhattan, right? So, this is very much public policy and futuristic thinking about sort of major events and stuff. And you're between the World's Fair and Shea. I mean, this is putting, literally and figuratively putting Queens, elevating it on the social map of New York, if you will. And also, too, probably aided and abetted, and I'm sure there was a coordination of some sort for this, by ready access to public transportation, namely the MTA, and with a little bit of a walk, the Long Island Railroad. That didn't hurt things either, I guess, when trying to convince people of its convenience, despite it being so distant, so to speak, from Manhattan.
Yes, and with it having... it also opened things up, because even Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds didn't have any parking, and one of the things they wanted to do was have people drive. That was, you put in all these parkways, you guys, you better have people driving around, and that enabled to use it. It was like I said, I grew up far enough away where public transportation was more of a nuisance than it was. You could drive there in like 25 minutes from where I grew up, and it was just easier to drive. But at some point, I would say like in the 90s, that it suddenly, you notice that there was just so many more people taking public transportation for whatever reason, or maybe it was just because I was getting older and noticing that kind of thing. But it seemed to change over time, and at Citi Field it's even more so now, that a lot of people take mass transit and have been taking it now for generations, and it really you might not Robert Moses gets a lot of grief for a lot of the things he did that weren't beneficial to a lot of neighborhoods in New York that got gutted to make all the parkways that he insisted on, and turning Shea Stadium from the land on Shea Stadium. It used to be a ash dump, and that's how they filled in filled it in. It used to be marshland, and turned it from a garbage dump into this excess land that they were trying to pawn off to this place that is the jewel of the outer boroughs. At least it was for a time, and really changed some of the dynamic. And by having the Mets there, that had to have some that led to the Islanders being there, and the Nets used to play out on Long Island as well. Whereas I think before that, people wouldn't have thought of that, or it might not have worked, or people people just thought differently about this stuff then. And I think the era of Shea, and when it came around, was people changing their minds, realizing that this isn't just some rich guy sport. This is a way to get a lot of things done, and make it a part of public policy and keep people entertained.
How
was important.
How would you describe the Mets and the Jets in their first couple of years, maybe even during the course of the 60s, as co-tenants? Obviously, we know who was sort of leading the dance between the two, but was there any friction along the way? How were the schedules coordinated, if at all? Could there be any overlap? I suspect in the beginning, the first couple of years, there wasn't any overlap, right? I mean, in terms of
the thing that really made it different, because I think when Shea opened, the NFL and the AFL, they might have been still playing 12 games, but the season didn't begin until like mid-September. So there, the football team opens its first couple of games on the road. It's not that big of a deal. Where it became a big deal was the Mets had a couple of Octobers where I think in '69 the Jets had a bunch, and the Jets were the defending NFL Super Bowl champions, and they're playing all their games on the road. But to open the season, and then later on, it does benefit them because they've suddenly got like 6 out of 7 games at home as the schedule gets tougher, and the games are more important. And but when this NFL switched to 16 games, and suddenly Labor Day is the opening of the NFL season, and there's still a good month of baseball to go. That's when they started going to court, and eventually there was a little leeway given. And the Jets opened, I remember my brother going, I think it was the first game opening day that they'd had in beginning of September. And so the Jets had the honor of having the horrific traffic with the U.S. Open instead of the Mets.
Well, there you go. And that's that's the gift that keeps on giving, right? Generations later, right?
Yes, and that's one of the things too. Is like for years I would be like, I don't want to go to a game in the end of August or early September because of that. But I noticed as years went on that there was less of once in a while you'd hit a real traffic jam, but there were so many people taking public transportation that it wasn't the 3-hour drive from 3 hours to drive 20 miles that it had been. Like in '86, I would leave. For I guess the games were 1:30 or so. If I left at 10:30 from my house, I would get there in the first inning because the traffic was that bad. And then once you got there was no place to park. You had to park, somewhere that you weren't even sure what town you were in.
Well, all that said, and look, to this day, getting to JFK from Manhattan is still an ordeal, right? But
yes.
That's the quintessential New York experience, and that's why New Yorkers love to hate it. But so I get the sense, though, that, baseball purists, right, probably saw opportunity with this new stadium, but also probably didn't like, the sheer scale, I guess, of the 4 or 5 or 6 layers or levels of this stadium. And how about the outfield, right, which this was not while this was multi-purpose as a stadium and maybe sort of at the vanguard of that sort of phenomenon circa as the rest of the 60s sort of played out, it was not fully enclosed. Sort of hulking sort of 5-tier structure kind of just created sort of this, I guess you could kind of describe it as sort of as a large letter C. But that also brought with it some problems now, didn't it? In terms of noise from a certain airport nearby, and also notoriously on many occasions, wind, right?
Yes, going to a Mets game, you could go to like a day, where it's 75, 80 degrees. You might even have shorts and a T-shirt on, and not even think of bringing a jacket unless you'd been to a few games at Shea Stadium. If you're sitting in the shade, you could freeze to death on an 80-degree day because of the wind, because of many different, just where it was built. It was, there's a lot, you still feel it today at Citi Field, that it can be beautiful in the sun and absolutely frigid in the shade. Not quite to the extent of Candlestick, but, if even for years, even into the 80s, the Mets' first homestand was often all-day games. They would have, they might throw one night game in on maybe a Friday night or Thursday or something like that. But they played day games because they knew it was going to be cold, and they probably knew the games weren't going to mean that much, so everyone might as well be happy because the weather was iffy there at best. It's a tough place to build to have something, but that's where it's New York. That's where the available land was. Kind of like, Candlestick. They did have some other choices, but they didn't have that many choices, and that's kind of where it ended up.
Well, I had a super high upper deck for sure, but I'm guessing too that expansive outfield was largely the result of the fact of the stadium being designed essentially as multipurpose for, in this case, football, right? So I guess purists kind of had a field day. Pardon the pun, about sort of just how expansive that outfield was relative perhaps to, or even the foul territory, right? Until the reconfigurations after the Jets left down the road.
Well, the foul territory was not that crazy because some of the those stadiums had a lot of foul territory, but compared to what a stadium is now, it did have an awful lot of foul territory. And, showing how different the game was, that it was sort of considered a hitter's park a little bit initially, or, at least people thought of it that way until, the late 60s came around, and then the Mets got that really good pitching staff, and then suddenly nobody was hitting at Shea, and especially the Mets, and, it was, the outfield was big. It was, the dimensions weren't that big initially. They pretty much stayed the same the entire time they were there, but it just goes to show how much the rest of the game changed. Even St. Louis, which I thought was one of the great home field advantages when Whitey Herzog had the team there and built the team around that, and they were almost impossible to beat in St. Louis especially. And then they got this home run hitter, and suddenly all the fences are in. And the team wasn't nearly as good, and that wasn't just same to the Cardinals. I mean, you look at Yankee Stadium; they moved. They always talked about how deep it was in left center and all that. And by the last few years at Yankee Stadium, it wasn't taking a mammoth shot to get the ball out in left center. You were seeing line drives go out that weren't even that high, but the game. The game sort of just changed along with it, and that took a lot of the way that people viewed it, and also the way that people viewed it from being this state-of-the-art stadium, as Brett pointed out with his book on the '75 season. That after that the stadium was never really quite the same. It just was completely abused, and. Pete Flynn was a great groundskeeper to keep it in as good a shape as it was.
All right, what's this? LinkedIn Jobs. Hey, These days, it can be hard to find and hire the right candidates for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs made it easier to find the people that you want to talk to faster and for free. Create a free job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 770 million people. My goodness. Focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, and use screening questions to get your role in front of only the most qualified. Then use the simple tools on LinkedIn Jobs to quickly filter and prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. Yes, it's no surprise, friends, that LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates that you want to talk to faster. Of course. Well, did you know that every week that nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Come on. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/goodseats. That's linkedin.com/goodseats to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And now, back to our conversation. I love the fact in this book, I mean, you go literally quite methodically and chronologically in sort of all the most important sort of nooks and crannies of importance of things that were going on at the time. But I also love the fact that you just didn't sort of keep it just to sports. You also, and rightly so, and I think it's kind of hard to avoid, right? Bring up sort of the concert that sort of, I don't know if they put the Beatles on the map here in the United States, but they certainly, it almost felt that way when they came around for their outdoor tour. And, given the fact that you had two brand new teams, a brand new stadium, a World's Fair, and then the Beatles, my goodness, I think there's probably no more, apex-like source of pride, I guess, for anybody involved in the construction of this stadium that, man, this was the right thing to do.
Yes, the stadium concert was sort of born there, although, on that tour, they did play in Kansas City, and they played in Cincinnati, and they played in some other places. But, it kind of almost felt that Shea Stadium was built for this. And, one of the reasons Shea didn't really have as many concerts as you would think, but they had a lot of high, marquee concerts because the Beatles played there and because so much was said about it that everyone, that was like the top of the mountain. The Police ended up breaking up when they went to Shea because they're like, well, there's really nowhere else to go. And even the Beatles, John Lennon said years later that was sort of the top of the mountain. And, after they did that, they, as a year later, after playing Shea one more time, they went out, played their last concert at Candlestick, which has probably been brought up more times in this discussion than it has in the last 20 years in the rest of the world. They've got the Who played here, and the Rolling Stones, and Bruce Springsteen, and there were some other bands that aren't quite as well known today, but were really big at the time, and a lot of that was, Shea Stadium was known to all these people in England who, don't know a thing about baseball and could care even less, and, and didn't care about football either, at least our version of it, but they all knew Shea Stadium because that was, the place where the Beatles came in, one of the, worst sound systems and one of the worst laid out concerts in history, but it certainly got the got the headlines.
No, and that's a very important point, right? I think that the experience of those kinds of very, let's call them primitive kinds of shows. I mean, all of the lads would have said that they couldn't hear themselves and all that kind of stuff. But also the sound of just the fans and the mania. But I think it's really important. I mean, you brought it up, right? So it almost cemented icon status for the stadium, even though I think really in retrospect, especially if you grew up and went to games and withstood some of the issues of said stadium, iconic. I don't think most people would sort of really in retrospect call it iconic, but perhaps more than any of the most memorable, the 86 Mets, the 69 Mets, the Jets, and their Super Bowl year, probably nothing more indelible or more iconic than that event, and perhaps than the pixie dust, the halo, the whatever, the vibes of that sort of just lingering on Shea for all eternity.
Again, it's not like it was this place that had championship teams cranking through. I mean, they did have in the 80s they had some really good teams, and there was a lot of excitement there, and it was really hard to get tickets to the Mets. And they were the first New York team to actually draw 3 million was at Shea, and but it was it wasn't fancy, and the Mets didn't win that much, but the ones that they did win, I think part of the whatever Shea magic there is made them memorable. They had those two, even the one against the A's with I rewatched one of the games, I think it was game 3, that the Mets were just snake bit. The A's were like in a funk because they'd had this whole thing with Mike Andrews. They wanted to strike. Their heads weren't in the game, and they were tattooing Catfish Hunter as one of the best postseason big game pitchers of his time, and pitched in plenty of those kind of games. And Tom Seaver's pitching and is having an amazing night. But the A's came back, and part of it was because the fans had torn up the field, and they had to take some of the grass from the warning track and put it on the infield. And so the warning track was a little different, and Don Hahn goes chasing after a ball I think Sal Bando hit, and all of a sudden he realizes he's not as close to the wall as he was, and the ball drops in, and they end up scoring. But the game is tied late, and I'm watching it, this replay of it, this bootleg that I got from somewhere, and John Milner hits a ball that hits the brick wall and bounces on the field and comes right back, and it's held into a single. But it was a tie game, in the 8th or 9th inning, and in the ground rule that they had at the end of the year, that would have been a home run, and maybe the Mets win the World Series because of that. The one ground rule that they ever changed in terms of the outfield, which I tried to point out in the book. And one other thing I did that was kind of fun was I sort of had someone, giving like a first-person tour of the stadium, like in the height at its height, like in 1987. When it was packed, and you could throw stuff at the guys in the bullpen, and you could sneak, which I did many times. You could sneak from like where the Diamond Club was. There was like a stairwell that you could go down, and it would take you right to where all of the concession stands were. And you could get onto the field level that way. It was a little tricky to do, but you could do it, and did it a bunch of times until one day they suddenly had an usher standing there, and the jig was up. But it was a great place to go get beer when none of the beers, when the beer lines were very long, because you could always grab somebody when they're coming out of that little area. Sure.
Well, look, we could go really deep on various Mets and Jets memories, but let's call out some. So as you were doing this book, either known or unknown, how about some standout either stories or unique things, either Jets or Mets related, or frankly otherwise? I think clearly the 1975 season, as we talked about with Brett, is certainly one of them. One little asterisk to that, which I didn't know until fairly recently, is that the New York Stars of the then fledgling and nascent World Football League in 1974 were looking at Shea to play. They ultimately were not able to do it, but you can. They went to Downing Stadium, which itself was its own disheveled story. And as a Cosmos fan growing up, I could relate stories there too. But can you imagine though the Stars adding to that craziness in '75 with a few more games during the summer? I'm sure the Mets would have just had a cow, or the Yankees too, for that matter.
There would have been no place for them to play because. I used to work on this preseason magazine, and we actually did a chart of all of the games that were played there that year. And I don't think there was a single day, maybe an occasional off day, but there were no days that there wasn't a team there. Like the Mets would be, and at the time they all played there's only 12 teams per league. So they all played sort of the same schedule, and the Mets are in Philadelphia, and the Yankees are playing Boston and New York, and there was no extra time. Even when the Giants played there in '75, they had to play a lot of games on Saturdays because there was no place for them, because the Jets couldn't start the season until October began, and they had most of the Sundays. So there was a few Saturday afternoon games that the Giants played, which other than those late season NFL games they usually play after college is over, I've never heard of an afternoon NFL game played on a Saturday unless there was some crazy extenuating circumstance.
See, I love that stuff.
The Cardinals and the Cowboys and the Colts all played at Shea multiple times too.
Yeah, I love that stuff. The
the
asterisks are what we're really interested in, is that kind of stuff. And that year was absolutely full of it for that stadium, for sure. I could even see some people probably try to sneak in and try to stick around for the next game the next day, because it's just it had to be an amazing, interesting, and exhausting time for everybody involved.
Yes, and Shea was, I go into it a little bit, but it was, I never fully snuck into Shea Stadium, but I know many people that snuck into it, including during the 1986 World Series. And it wasn't, Fort Knox, I guess would be the way to say it. And I did a book, 100 Things Mets Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die, where I did like a tour of all of the decks. And, that essentially for much of its run, maybe until the last 8 or 10 years, maybe when they, picked up again in the late 90s, the security started coming down a little harder on where you could sit. But before then, you could, as long as you weren't glomming someone's seat in the orange seats down by the field, you could sit most anywhere you wanted that someone wasn't already sitting. The ushers kind of had a whole separate economy based on where you would do it. And if there was a seat that wasn't popular, you didn't even have to go to the usher. You just sit down. And, that was great. And one thing that I miss about Shea and a lot of the new stadiums don't have is they have staircases going up and down. You can't go from the right field foul pole all the way around, which could take an entire inning to do. And, if you had bad seats in the corner, you could kind of just walk around and, catch, at a big moment in the game, be standing right behind home plate, 100 feet from the back of the catcher, walking past. There was nothing to stop you, which was made those seats that were in front of them. I had a friend who had season tickets, and he gave me the honor of going down and picking them out while he was away in law school, and that was one of the things that we decided not to do. The seats look great, but when people are sitting in there, that place was completely different. And even those, seats that were pretty good in the, field level, you had to crick your neck a little bit. And if one person could sit there and block your view of the game, across this wide expanse of people, if one person was sitting in the wrong spot or was an extra size or something like that, or was wearing an extra big hat or something, you would be looking at them more than you'd be looking at, Dave Kingman or David Wright or whomever.
Any particular events, either related to the Jets or the Mets or otherwise, that stick out in your mind that fans who may be either new to the story or don't even know about the stadium might be either surprised about, or you found was surprising, or frankly you want people to know about that most people don't?
Let's see. There was that banner day. I'm not sure if they're bringing it back again, but until, the Mets were like the last team that had a scheduled doubleheader, and it was because of banner day. I think it was finally in 1988 they made it a single game, and it lasted, a few years after that. But, I never made a banner, but I thought it was, great to go watch. One year when the Mets turned it around, 84, and people were so ecstatic that the Mets actually had a good team, and they were in first place on banner day, and it was a big series against the Cubs, and they actually had to stop people because it had already been going on for like an hour and 20 minutes, and the Cubs had to fly, and it was a getaway day. And it's like, let's go, we're here to play baseball, people. That was great, and seeing all of the banners come by. That was kind of resplendent. It was like a giveaway. Another thing was that they didn't have that many giveaway days, but they had a lot of days where you could kind of participate like that. There was, a picture day. I'm surprised they didn't have like write your favorite player a note day. They had they gave out batting helmets and occasionally they gave out bats, but that was really kind of a Yankees thing. And although I do have a bat I'm looking at here from Edgardo Alfonso that was I think in the late 90s they had Edgardo Alfonso bat day. That was an actual bat. And the following year, the last game of the year, because it had been rained out earlier, the Mets won on a wild pitch to earn a spot to go to the one-game playoff against Cincinnati, and it was they were flying to Riverfront Stadium, or whatever they were calling it then. So people were walking out, and they handed them all clubs on the way out. They weren't full-size bats, but they were baton size, and it was like, this is a great day, and here's a little. I've got that sitting in my office here too. Little things like that. They had just these weird giveaways that. I remember they had Irish Night. They used to have these international days where probably in the late 90s was when they had most of them, maybe early 2000s. And they would have different nights for different ethnic groups. And Irish Night was always a big night, and sometimes they give out a hat. You get a green hat or something that was Irish in nature. But one time they gave out Irish Spring at the end of it after, on a particularly hot night. And handing out soap to everybody. And, this person behind me walking out was like, I don't think I've ever been so insulted in my life, Like, you stink. Here's some soap. And, little fun things like that. And, the last game at Shea was really hard because it was, a difficult loss. But I thought of all the things that they did, Mets weren't necessarily great at celebrating themselves or, always taking themselves as seriously, I think, as their fans took them. And I thought they did a great job on the last day of the ceremony, not of losing to the Marlins, but that was a really great ceremony, and having the everybody touch home plate. I guess it had happened before, but I never really paid attention to it. I mean, when Willie Mays, who could barely see, is bending down to touch it, you're like, this is serious stuff. And for all the difficulties that happened that day, I thought that was one of the better moments that Shea had. And it would only if they had won that game or the game had meant absolutely nothing, it would have probably been much better remembered. And the number of games I've been to at Citi Field that were really must be games. You felt a genuine buzz. Involved either Matt Harvey during his little run, and which was short-lived, and the first game of the World Series. There was a definite buzz there, but and maybe for those playoff games. But I don't go to as many games as I used to, I have to admit. But I used to go to 20, 25 games at Shea every year, and probably went to 20 at Citi Field when it first opened. But Shea, when it was a big game, there was nothing, you didn't have to tell everybody. The place was suddenly packed with 55,000 people, and that place would be swaying, at all the big moments. And sometimes when people were bored, they'd make the stadium sway too, because they could.
And I suspect that the 80s in particular was a high time, right? Given just how good the team was, and obviously the 86 series and all that. But let me just end with sort of this, I guess, this sort of area, this kind of question, because it's always sort of fascinated me is in 83, 84, right? So the Jets leave for the somewhat siren song of domiciling with the Giants across the way in the quote unquote Giant Stadium, being the second tenant there. They just couldn't get used to being the second tenant in places. But I digress. As a former Jet fan, I could wax philosophical about that. explain that sort of that year and that scenario to me, because was that kind of like, okay, good riddance, and was it now more palatable, I guess, for the Mets to be the only, if you will, game in that stadium, to be able to at least not have to worry about transforming the field and all the logistics that are needed to kind of play host to two different types of events during the course of a year, and they could maybe more focus on just baseball only stuff and not worry about all the rest of it that the Jets brought along for the ride?
Well, they still had the Police concert, which I went to in 1983, and I was going off to college then, and I was just thinking about it today, and I'm sitting there, and it's hot, and I've got this warm beer in my hand, and I'm sitting in these seats that are terrible for baseball, football, or a concert.
Yeah.
In the sort of in the loge section, way in the back with the overhang, and I'm just like, gosh, I wish the last place Mets were here. I would be enjoying that so much more. I'd rather be seeing them, and. The Mets, Nelson Doubleday made.
They were able to, the groundskeeper, I mean, they were able to kind of at least maybe focus more on baseball then as sort of, right? And
the field, when the Mets did come back, because it rained during the concert a little bit, was an absolute disaster. Balls were bouncing off it, like a super ball. Fortunately, the Mets weren't any good, so no one paid that much attention to it. But it was, like playing on a bunch of cut-up carpet. I never had a problem with the Jets really being there because it kind of made it. I thought it made it a little more fun. I always liked the two teams in one stadium. I thought, to be honest, I've always thought that having two stadiums for two different teams seemed kind of wasteful to me. At least the Jets and the Giants played in the same stadium. But
it made it more of a mecca, right? I mean, in some respect, a year-round mecca, because you had stuff.
Yeah, it made it a destination place, and I thought it was a little bittersweet when the Jets left, and in typical Mets/Jets fashion, they kind of just got blown out by the Steelers. Ended up being Terry Bradshaw's last game too. He hurt he threw a touchdown pass and hurt his elbow on the play and never played again. And but I watched it when it was while it was happening. It was because it was one of those Saturday afternoon games late in the year, so it was on national TV, and I was able to watch it from school. And it was kind of sad. And the people were, I watched. They have a really good. NFL Network did something on that game, and really kind of captured it and some of the stuff that I wasn't getting because I wasn't in New York at that moment. That it was kind of sad, and they're moving over to to go be, like you said, be second fiddle to another team. At least the Mets aren't in the same aren't in the same sport. You have the place all to yourself for a few months out of the year, and it was kind of fun. But and I think the players kind of like having some overlap. As they were getting into the 80s, they all didn't need to be sharing apartments, but there was apartments shared by the Mets and the Yankees when they were there. I couldn't get any good stories about anyone sharing them, but a few people said that was going on that I talked to. But that kind of stuff was fun, and made it feel like a professional athlete was a job. It wasn't some someone that people would resent because they made all this money. It's someone who got paid more, but their career was usually over by the time they were 30 or 35.
All right, here's my last question then. What do you miss the most about Shea Stadium, and frankly, what don't you miss about Shea?
Well, the food would definitely be the thing, but as Howie Rose told me, it was like, I didn't go there to eat. I was going there to watch a ball game, and so that gives it some hindsight. But the food was definitely questionable, even on a good day. They had a thing called the Met Hero that was great compared to everything else, but that kind of, there's only certain stands that sold it, and it required a lot of mustard. So that was the only thing I really liked. And I did find an article about when the New York Times had their gourmet review the food at Shea, which I thought was kind of a hoot. And But the thing I miss the most is, it just was kind of the atmosphere when that place, when that team was good. I remember going to my first playoff game after being a fan for like 10 years, because I'd become a fan in 1975, and they did not make the playoffs until 1986, and then went through all of my grammar school, and when I said in 1975 it was 14-14 or whatever tie between Mets and Yankees fans. By 1978 it was like 28-3, and so there was a lot of moments you didn't think the team would ever be any good, and it was hard at times keeping the emotions in check going to that. And my first game was the game where Lenny Dykstra hit the home run, which again, to beat the Astros, and still probably. And I went to the Grand Slam single game too, and I would put the Lenny Dykstra home run game there because they won the game and the series and the World Series, but it was just so special because they had not been played there since Wednesday night or maybe the Thursday night in 1973 for a postseason game with the bunting and everything like that, and fell behind early and came back and won in dramatic fashion, and that one, just the way that place roared and was remarkable. And I've always wished I had a chance to go to games 1 or 2 or games 6 and 7 in the World Series. And of course, being a cocky Met fan in 1986, I went to games 1 and 2, and always wished that I had chosen differently, because that. I was always a little jealous of the people that did go to that one. But, as time's worn on, I'm just happy I was alive when they won a championship. Because there's plenty of guys and ladies who are sitting in the stands that haven't had that. So I hope that the Mets, wherever they're playing, will win one for them sometime soon.
Well, I've got personal memories myself, and my first ever NFL game was at Shea. It was a birthday gift, and sadly, it was also memorable for another reason. It was the infamous halftime flying model airplane exhibition that bulldozed.
Yeah, that was something that I did not know about until I was doing research for this book. It was shaped like a lawnmower.
Yeah, they call it
what a way to go.
Lawnmower, and 2 people were seriously injured. One of them succumbed to his injuries, and I was literally there with 3 of my friends, and I'll never forget it. I mean, there was a guy who was just had a bottle of bourbon with him, and he was more than halfway through it, and his friends were egging him on, and he jumped over the fence and grabbed a football from underneath the jet bench, and then ran back into the stands, and then all the fans were holding back the police to let the guy go, and he's probably still running today with that football under his arm. But that was my introduction to football and Shea Stadium, and as a kid growing up in northern New Jersey, it was sort of a little bit of the wild east, if you will. But you knew you were in. This was a fans' stadium. This was like, these were serious fans, regardless of what the team was at the time. And you knew that it was in that respect, it was quite a special place because the fans were really into what, even if the teams sucked, the Jets and the Mets in particular, who were generally really good at doing that. The fans were there. They were there for a good time, and they were intense. And boy, that was an experience. Frankly, a memory I'll never forget.
Well, and one thing was that the seats were basically on merit. You had to earn them. A banker who complained about how bad the Mets were and no one ever used their tickets, I said, well, give them to me. So I ended up getting these seats right behind the on-deck circle, and a friend of mine had seats out in the left field part of the same orange seats down below. Much different view, but the tickets cost the exact same. And on the little panel that said who, and they used to have the panel that said who it belonged to. It said how long they'd been there, and these people had these seats behind there because they had gotten them in like 1978. So those were earned, and my friend had gotten them, in the mid 90s, and you moved up a little bit each year. So when people had really good seats, it wasn't because they'd paid this much extra. They had earned it, and the seats were priced accordingly. I mean, but that guy's seats, I think, were $50, $70, maybe tops, and now $70, for a Saturday afternoon game is going to have you sitting pretty far out there.
Yeah, I remember
with this ridiculous variable price seating, which
no doubt.
I always annoyed me. It's like the Mets are the ones that tell you who is a good team and who isn't. They should wish.
Yeah, too bad they can't apply it to the actual Mets team sometimes, right? But I just remember too the sort of the inelegant sort of these square boxes, right, of 4 seats, right?
Yeah.
Which is odd because if you've got 2 people or 3 people or 5 people, it becomes an odd situation when you're trying to sit together.
Yes, I have, and I've actually had that. The way those were set up keep me from catching a foul ball because they kept you from reaching over. It like had you boxed in depending where you're sitting. You had to sort of sit on the end seat, and you had much more dexterity of movement if you want to catch a foul ball. And I finally caught a foul ball after hundreds of games there. In the second game of the last Father's Day doubleheader at Shea, when there was about 5,000 people left in the stadium for a game that had been sold out initially. Just a further illustration of how much the game had changed. But I was glad I stayed all the way to the end because that was the only one I got at Shea, and it had the little icon on it that the stadium they had for that last year.
Many thanks to Matthew. Fantastic memories. So many more we could have gone into. The book, Shea Stadium Remembered, the Mets, the Jets, and Beatlemania. It is published by our friends at Lions Press, which is an imprint of Globe Picot and is part of the trade division of Rowman and Littlefield. Regardless of what brand or imprint you find, get the book. You can find it at all great bookstores and stuff. Of course, you can find it on Amazon and a convenient link to Amazon to give us a few pennies, nickels, dimes, even shekels of referral love by doing so at our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 257 with Matthew Silverman. You'll find a convenient link there. We'll get a couple of pennies. We appreciate that. And you can also search while you're there at goodseatsstillavailable.com every single stinking episode we've ever done. We post them all there. It's a convenient place. Of course, the easiest way, though, to follow us and make sure that you get the very latest episodes is in your feed by following us or subscribing, whatever the mechanism is these days to get podcasts. We're available just wherever you can find. And tell your friends, for God's sakes. We appreciate that, too. We can't give you any anything but our love and our friendship for doing so. But we appreciate you spreading the word, especially if you like what you hear. Let's see. You can follow Matthew at a bunch of places. You can go to his website at Met Silverman. Yes, that's MET Silverman, SILVERMAN.com, metsilverman.com. See what he did there for all his other great stuff. He's done a ton of books around Shea, but certainly the Mets, a lot of historical and trivia-oriented stuff around that. There's a Cubs book, a Red Sox by the numbers book, lots of great stuff, and for you to find there at metsilverman.com. You can also follow Matthew on Twitter at metsilverman, what else? You can follow us on Twitter at goodseatsstill. You can follow us on Instagram at goodseatsstillavailable, and you can follow our little Facebook page as well there, Good Seats Still Available as well. Would you like to send us some email? Okay. Please do so at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We appreciate that. And we have a little weekly email newsletter. Check out the website, find the little tab there for that, and just a name and an email address, and you'll know what's coming up a few days or even sometimes a few hours before we release it to the general public, and you'll be in the know. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Jerry Payne, of course, for your editorial excellence this week. Until next week, we bid you a fond adieu. Hang in there. Spring is coming, as so I'm told. Until then, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you. Bye.